want to begin by giving a little bit of background on the slowdown. Why has this economy been slowing down? And if you focus on the post-2010 period, I would say the main reason is that investment in the property sector has moderated quite dramatically. If you go back to 2010, we're looking at property growth in the neighborhood of 35, almost 40%. And since 2010, it's pretty steadily declined. The official number for last year was 1%. This investment in property accounted at the beginning for as much as 25% of overall investment. Its share has declined now to 20%. It's still quite important. But this slowdown in property investment, which by the way I don't think is a bad thing, because China had been over-investing in property and I've been writing about that for a long time. But that dragged down major parts of the industrial sector: steel, coal, electric power, everything that goes into making building materials has slowed down dramatically. And so you can see by 2015, some of these major products were actually shrinking in terms of their output, and that dragged down industrial growth. A very, very substantial decline from about 16% in the first quarter of 2010 to just under 6% in the fourth quarter of last year. So this is what's been driving, as was just mentioned, driving China's growth down to the lowest level in quite a few years. Now, I want to give you a little bit more optimistic view. These numbers get a lot of attention because they come out every month. They're very detailed. Everybody wants to know what's happening in China, so people rely a lot on these monthly numbers. The service sector doesn't get as much attention because the data only come out quarterly. It's not as granular, disaggregated, and so forth. But I think if you look at this diagram, you can see since 2012, the third quarter of 2012, services have become the biggest driver of China's economic growth. And this became even more apparent starting in the fourth quarter in 2014, where the gap between service sector growth and industrial sector growth got wider. And then last year, we see a very, very wide gap between service sector growth and industrial sector growth. And the result now is that the service sector accounts for half of GDP. It's more important in terms of contribution to GDP than is the industrial sector. So part of my message is, if you want to understand what's going on in the Chinese economy, we should be looking more at what's happening in services and a little bit less on what's happening in the industrial sector. And the main argument I want to make actually is that I think the growth of the service sector is likely to continue. The service sector is likely to become an even larger share of Chinese economy because of a whole series of factors which I'm going to spend most of my time on. I start with demographics. As we all know, China's working age population shrank for the first time last year, declined by something like 2%. I think this is bound to continue, this rapid aging of the population. We've already been in an environment where wages have grown fairly rapidly for the better part of a decade. Wage growth feeds into consumption, feeds into demand, and the demographics make it likely that wage growth will continue to be at least as strong as it has been in the past. The second factor that's driving the service sector is Engel's law, this simple observation made a long time ago, that once you get up to certain levels of income, people spend more and more on services and less on goods. China's already entering this phase. If you look at private consumption expenditure in China, about half of it is now on services rather than goods, and it's risen by about 5 percentage points. That share has risen by about 5 percentage points over the last decade. You can see this obviously, increased expenditures on tourism, education, health, entertainment, and so forth. Everybody's pretty well fed and clothed, so they're spending money increasingly on other things. So what you have here is a combination of rising incomes and more of that income being directed towards the service sector. Now, the third factor is that the savings rate in China has begun to decline. China is famous in the household sector for having a savings rate that by our standards here in the West is in the stratosphere. but the data make it look like the savings rate of households has begun to decline. The peak seems to be 2010. The data on this come out with an even longer lag, so there's some uncertainty. But this is reinforcing the tendency for more demand because not only do we have wages growing, but we have we have a decrease in savings, so people are spending a larger share of their wages. And the second factor, of course, is Engel's law. Now, why I have built out the social safety net, I am of the view, and have been of the view for some time, that one of the reasons China had such a high savings rate was the lack of a social safety net. But China has made very, very substantial progress over the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years in building out the social safety net, whether you're looking at pensions or health care. A very large share of the population is now covered by some form, and I emphasize some form, of health insurance or retirement income. So not everybody needs to self-insure for when somebody in their family has to go to the hospital. Some of the costs, a very large share of the costs, may be covered by one of the health insurance schemes that has been built out. In the rural program, the Rural Cooperative Health Care Program, it started on an experimental basis about 10 years ago. The central government was putting in 20 RMB per person who would participate in this program. This year they're contributing 420 RMB per person who participates in the program. So this is a cooperative scheme. The reimbursement rates vary a little bit, but people have a much better social safety net than they did earlier, and I think it's beginning to show up in a decline in the household savings rate. Fourth factor, at the risk of getting a little obscure, the undervaluation of the currency, which was very pronounced in the decade of the 2000s, basically was a subsidy for the industrial sector. Remember, 90% of what China exports is industrial goods. If your currency is undervalued, you sell something for $1 in the international market. When you convert it into RMB, you get more RMB than you otherwise would. So undervaluation was an implicit subsidy for the industrial sector. That has pretty much disappeared. Last year, the IMF said for the first time that they think the currency is no longer significantly undervalued. And we can see the result. In the decade of the 2000s, investment in services as a share of total investment went down almost every year. In the last 3 or 4 years, since the currency has been approaching an equilibrium level, the share of overall investment going into services has actually gone up quite remarkably. And it's a very different picture than you think. I think many people think, oh, China's investing in smokestack industries, that's why they have all this overcapacity. But in 2015, about 57% of all investment went into the service sector, and in the first quarter of this year, according to the data that were released last week, about 59%, almost 60% of all investment is now going into the service sector, and the share that's going into the manufacturing sector is actually declining. Probably should be declining even more rapidly than it has, but at least directionally, it's moving in the right direction. So the first three factors here are kind of on the demand side for services. This fourth factor is on the supply side. The relative labor intensity of services is also very important because it feeds back into the first factor, that is rising wages. Service sector is more intensive, so you get more job creation for any given amount of value added, and that feeds back, and so you begin to have kind of a virtuous cycle. Then the last factor, I think even some of the China specialists in the audience may be a little surprised about what I'm going to say, but the traditional view of the service sector is that it has been very, very dominated by state companies and has not been open to private investment, indigenous private companies. You think of the banking and insurance, where all the big companies are state-owned, but there actually has begun to be a significant opening of services to private entrepreneurs. Now, some of these have been open for a long time. Anybody who's been going to China over the years knows the huge increase in hotels and restaurants and so forth is largely due to the rise of private investment. Restaurants and hotels, by 2014, 70% of the investment in those activities was by private companies, but this got started even a little bit in the 80s and accelerated quite a bit in the 90s. As early as 2004, the state share of investment in restaurants and hotels was less than 30% of the total. So in other words, 70% was either indigenous private companies or foreign companies. But the services sectors that I want to talk about today are what some economists call modern business services: information transmission, IT software, financial intermediation, that means banking, insurance, asset management, and so forth, leasing and business service. Leasing is a very big business in China. And the last of these four is scientific research and technical services. Now, as you can, so these lines are showing the share of investment in these components of services that is being undertaken by private companies. And the takeaway here basically is, if you go back a little more than 10 years ago, private companies had very little to no access. They were not allowed to invest in these activities. But over the last 10 years, the share of investment undertaken by private companies has gone up quite a bit. So for example, even in financial intermediation, where we think of the state as being completely dominant, about 25% of all the investment in 2014, which is the most recent data we have, was being undertaken by private companies. If you look at leasing and business services, it's something closer to 50% of all the investments being undertaken by private companies. Well, why do we care about this? We care about this because the record of state companies in the service sector is abysmal. They are very, very inefficient. The average return on assets of state companies in the service sector is about 3.5%, which is probably roughly half the cost of capital. Private service firms are much more efficient, have much higher returns. So my view is, as you can increasingly open up the service sector to private investment, that has a huge improvement in productivity because private firms are so much more efficient. It'll generate more economic growth and push up China's GDP to even higher levels. So my conclusion is basically that the transformation of this economy from a predominantly industrial driven one to one that is more service driven has started. It's getting some traction in the last 5 years or so, and I think there are a number of structural factors that will continue to drive that. If you look at these things, it's very unlikely that these factors are going to be reversed. The demographics is obviously baked in. The Engel curve is baked in. Every country in the world experiences this phenomenon. I don't think the government's going to announce tomorrow afternoon that they're going to dismantle the social safety net for obvious reasons. I don't think they're going to have an undervaluation of their currency. I think they've given up on that mercantilist strategy of the 2000s. The relative labor intensity of services is baked in, and the opening up, I hope, of these service sectors, these modern business services to private investors will continue. I think it's very unlikely to be rolled back. In fact, what I would anticipate is that eventually this will be further liberalized, and you will see some private foreign firms beginning to move into some of these spaces. When I'm talking about private investment here, I'm talking about indigenous private investment by Chinese private companies. But I think eventually China might follow the model that it used in the manufacturing sector. Remember, in the manufacturing sector, originally it was opened up primarily to indigenous companies, but with a lag then, a lot of foreign companies were able to move into the manufacturing sector. And for the last decade or more, about 25% of all manufacturing output in China has been produced by foreign companies. So eventually maybe we'll move to that in the services area as well. We've seen it a little bit in hotels and catering, where private firms have a substantial footprint, and I hope eventually we'll see it in this area as well. So thank you.